If I was to put my hand on a surface of some kind, actually let me pull back a bit from that. If I was blind, or at least had my eyes closed, and I put my hand on a surface of some kind, and I put it down very carefully and didn't move it, I wouldn't have a clue what I was touching. I might feel the contact, but if I kept my hand perfectly still, even that initial feeling of contact would disappear. It isn't until I move my hand slightly, or allowed it to tremble or something like that, that I would start to get a sense of what I had my hand on. The little movements left and right that I would make will give me information about the texture of this substance, this object, this surface, and the small movements up and down will give me information about the resilience of the object, whether it was hard or soft. But I still wouldn't have an awful lot of information about the object. I would have information about its texture and its surface resilience. In order to get more information about it, its size for example, or its shape, I would have to move my hand across its surface, perhaps till I found an edge, something like that, and then ran my hand over its edge to get a sense of the contour of that edge, whether it was rounded or sharp or so on. What would be happening to give me that information, I think, is that feedback from my proprioceptive system, the sensors in the joints of my fingers and arms and hands, would be sending information to my brain, effectively telling me how far my hand had moved. But I would experience that as a gauging of the size and shape of the object, or the surface of the object that I was running my hand across. In other words, the haptic experience that I would have of this surface, of this object, would only result from an enactive process. Until I do something with my hand, I have no information about it. I think this is written about well in cybernetics. I think Norbert Wiener writes about this, and Francisco Varela, and other cyberneticians, Mascherano, writes about this. And I think they call it something like news of difference. But perceptions, our perception of the size, shape, texture, contours of an object or surface are not sort of absolute qualities, they are news of difference. I think elsewhere Norbert Wiener talks about these differences as the difference that makes a difference. It's the difference between one part of a surface and another part of a surface that gives it a texture. So if I run my hand across sandpaper, it's the fact that the surface at one point has a grain of sand in it, and the surface at an adjacent point has a small gap before the next grain of sand. So it's the difference between one moment on the surface and the next that provides the information that we refer to as texture or shape or contour. That's all pretty straightforward, I think, isn't it? Funny about that. What I'm intrigued by right now is the fact that seems to be also how seeing works. And here I'm indebted to Regan and Noe's work on enactive vision, in which they make a really robust claim, I think, that seeing, visual perception, works in a very much a similar way. That while we tend to think of seeing, to think of the eye as a kind of camera, and you just hold your eye steady and allow the shutter of your eyelids to flash, and there's the world presented to you. That's an incorrect understanding of how the eye works. But in order to see, the eye has to move in the same way that in order to feel, the hand has to move. So the eye is never stationary. In fact, to the extent that the eye is stationary, is the extent that it loses its ability to see. Again, in the same way that if you hold your hand still, eventually you feel nothing under your fingertips. If it was possible to hold your eye perfectly still, you would stop seeing things. Your retina would stop registering the impact of light. So the eye doesn't stay still, it's constantly moving in saccades, effectively flickering across the visual field, allowing different wavelengths, different intensities of light to fall on different parts of the retina. So we have this constant presentation of difference to the senses, the back of the eye, and ultimately to the visual senses of the brain. And it's the differences that are being recorded there which provide information about sight. So this saccading is sort of the equivalent of texture. It gives us information about the colour, for example, or the visual texture of a surface that we're looking at, or the light intensity, the reflective intensity of the surface we're looking at. But our eyes are constantly doing not just these micro saccades, they're sometimes called, but quite large saccades. They're constantly switching, finding moments of pause, and then moving across the visual field somewhere else. And what's happening there, Regan and Noe would say, is that the eye is kind of finding edges of rooftops and tree branches, the edges of motorway bridges and birds' wings. And these edges are being consistently found by the retina, and that information again is being presented back to the visual centres of the brain. And just in the same way that it's the feedback from the proprioceptive system in the hand and arm, which is ultimately providing that information about movement to allow that mapping to take place within the haptic sense. So are similar things taking place in the visual sense. There are sensors in the muscles around the eye which are mapping the movements that the eye makes as it does these saccades, as it makes these moments of fixation followed by moments of movement, tracking where everything is in relation to each other through this feedback from the muscles. And it's that system which processes all that news of difference and makes a visual field out of it. And of course it's not just the eyeball that's involved in that, it's also the movements of the head, which are also providing feedback, movements to the neck and the upper body and so on. So what's happening there is that this complex map of our body, the image schema of our body, is constantly present within vision and constantly being used as a set of points around which the world is mapped, which is why we can make sense of things like perspective, and why we can be walking along the street, moving our arms and head, neck, flicking our eyes around, looking at the world, watching moving cars. And despite having all that movement going on, we're still able to keep track of what's stationary and what's moving. So the eye, in that sense, is a kind of hand reaching out into the world, feeling the contours of the object, running its conceptual fingertips over the surfaces of the world, and getting information about textures as well. Textures.